Hey y'all, this is BA and I'm fixing to read the first half of Chapter 3 on Redemption's Ride. Chapter 3. 3 dust-filled, empty little towns later, Hawk was still with them. The man's horse Fred was more talkative than he was, but Hawk pitched in and worked, and a man could hardly know he was there, unless that man was aware of every move Hawk made, stealing glances out of the corners of his eyes. Ridiculous to be so caught by somebody who was entirely impossible. But there it was. Preacher looked at the horizon, taking his hat off to wipe his brow. They had provisioned the night before, for the good townspeople had told them they had 3 days of desert before the next small community, and so they were on their own. Little Bear seemed completely pleased by this turn of events. So did Hawk, come to think on it. Abraham was the one who sat stiff and nervous on his donkey, searching for the brush and rocks for animals or engines. "Would you calm down, Abraham?" he said. "We're unlikely to be overrun by giant lizards." "So you say, sir, but I have seen no proof whatsoever that these lands are hospitable." Hawk looked over, arched one pitch-black eyebrow, but didn't say so much as a word. Preacher hid a smile. Truly, it was almost as if he and Hawk shared a joke whenever Abraham initiated such a conversation. It eased his lonely soul. "Well, I did offer to let you shelter back in the town." "With those ruffians? I dare say they'd have me tied to the well to chase off wild dogs before you were out of sight." Hawk spit and grinned. "Nah, them dogs are good eating. You'd have been bait." A laugh welled in his chest, and Preacher chuckled, the sounds hidden under Abraham's gasps and grunts. He winked at Hawk, feeling easier in his bones than he had in months. It was the most fascinating thing. There were moments when Hawk seemed almost an old man, then other times where he seemed nearly young. The man never growled over being called son or boy, but Preacher wondered if being called old man would get any response either. "Well, Bear, where do you think we ought to hang our hats for the night?" They had maybe a good hour left of riding before they all got too damn tired and the dog's 3 legs gave out. Bear grunted and pointed to the gathering darkness, then a bare escarpment a ways off. It would give them some shelter, some protection from the wind and the critters. "That would do, then." He nodded. "Looks good, Bear." They turned just a bit south, heading that way, and Preacher nudged his mount over toward Hawk, lowering his voice. "You familiar with this land at all, son?" "I am." A ghost of something passed over Hawk's face, something part sick and part scared, and more than a little bit of fury. "I was born not a day's ride from here." "Shall we move on before we camp, then?" He wanted to know what would put a look like that on Hawk's face, but he knew he had no right to ask. Hawk looked up to the sky, squinted. "The clouds aren't black. I don't see no bad storms brewing. We'll manage a night." "I meant in deference to your upbringing here." That was quite a statement. Bad things. Yeah, he knew all about that. Preacher looked at Dime, who ran back and forth between the horses and the sides of the trail, sniffing at this or that. "No bad things. Ain't nobody here knows any Hawk, I can vouch for it." The man would admit no weakness, he supposed. "Well, then we'll make our camp and be glad of it." His behind was hurting fierce. "I'll ride ahead, see if I can't hunt up water." Hawk leaned some, that horse seeming just to know what the man was thinking and heading off. Preacher sighed, watching the fine way the man sat a horse, letting himself stare a good long minute before turning his attention back to the trail. That man rode like he was born to it, and as he rode, it looked to Preacher like the light seemed to shun him and leave him in shadow. Well, that was some trick of the clouds, wasn't it? "What's that?" he asked Abraham, who'd asked him something. "I said, do you think he will leave us out here to die?" It took a full minute for Preacher to pick his jaw up off his chest. "Now, what on earth possessed you to think we can't survive without him? We got Bear. Besides, he's looking for water. That's what he said, and I believe him." Bear watched, grunted. Whether it was agreement of the fact the man was hunting water or that they'd survived just fine, he didn't know. Either way worked, he reckoned. The shadows got long as they reached the escarpment, Bear moving straight away to get a fire on. Preacher helped settle the horses as Abraham sacked out for a siesta. But once he got him fed and set, he wandered, lighting up a cheroot. Bear hated it when Preacher left the safe confines of camp, but he didn't worry about what might be out there in the coming dark. He worried more about what hid under the faces of everyday people. He heard a low, tuneless whistle coming from the west. He couldn't tell how far away it was, but he could hear it echoing, bouncing off the stone. He He hoped to God it was Hawk. If they decided to camp out at some robber's roost, he'd have to think about turning to the other side. As he got closer, he heard splashing and a low laugh. "Back off, Fred. Can't a man wash the dust off his face?" Well, that was indeed Hawk, and if there was a spring or a watering hole, the man was holding out on him. Preacher snuck around an outcropping of rock, looking. Hawk had stripped his shirt off and was filling skins with water. The long back was tanned as an Indian's and twice as scarred up, but it sure shined pretty in the fading sun, all wet and slick. For a bit, all he heard was his own heavily beating heart. He hadn't even let himself look in so long. Hell, he hadn't even seen anyone worth looking at an age. Hawk was worth the extra year he'd spent roasting in hell to have the thoughts he is having now. The dark hair looked damn near copper in the last bit of sun. The black hat was sitting on the rock a bit a ways, along with the heavy saddlebags. Fred was drinking deep, staying close to Hawk like he was protecting the man. Hell, maybe he was. Horse was tame as a dog. Tamer than Dime by a damn sight, long as he was with Hawk. Shifting from foot to foot, Preacher watched the shadows steal over Hawk, watched the way they dappled Hawk's skin, showing off the movement of the muscles beneath. His mouth was dry as a man who was recovering from a 3-day binge. Hawk stood and stretched, waistband dark with water, hands reaching up toward the sky as he licked water off his mustache. "You gonna just watch, or you gonna come with your whistle?" "Shit fire." Preacher jumped a mile, but he figured he might as well not act like he'd done anything wrong, so he went on down to the little grade and headed right to the water. "I didn't want to bother you." "Ain't no bother. Water's good and cool." That raspy voice would jar a rattler. Preacher nodded slowly and doffed his hat, wondering at the wisdom of stripping to the waist with this man next to him. He'd never turned to a slather and beef before, though, so no matter the temptation. He shrugged off his long black coat and undid the starched collar of his thin shirt. "Looks good. Feels like pure heaven." Those pale eyes dragged over him once, then skittered away like a new-pinned horse. His skin drew up like a cool breeze had started, and Preacher bent to cup the water in his hands and pour it over his head. It also hid the evidence of his interest, which might well become inconvenient. "I didn't think this place would still be here." Hawk squatted beside him, fingers dragging in the water. Oh, that did indeed feel like heaven, even if it was slightly brackish on top. Once you got beneath, you could tell it was a spring. He wet his face and chest, trying to ignore Hawk's heat. "Where are we headed next?" Hawk's face was turned toward the south, almost looking for something. "I'm figuring Inge. It's small, but that might be good for us." The smaller towns seemed to breed the kinds of things Preacher lived to ferret out. You'd think more people would want to come and pray and tithe in the bigger cities. Oh, they come in droves, but that's not all that makes a successful tent meeting. He rocked back on his heels and looked at the sky himself, feeling the slightest breeze drying the water on his throat. God did provide, didn't he? What else is there? He could hear Hawk breathing, the way the air rasped in and out of the mangled throat. Dark hair curled with sweat at the man's neck, just behind the scars. There's special kinds of sinners. Preacher stood, letting water slide all the way to his waist. His pecker had gone right down at the thought of some of the things he'd seen. "Thank you for sharing the spring, son." "You're welcome, Padre." Hawk stood, moving away from him and shrugging on the lawn shirt. "Some of us are special. That's for damn sure." He sighed a little at the loss of all that fine skin, then turned back toward the camp, pulling his own shirt over his wet body and grabbing his hat. "No, I didn't mean you, son. You're not that kind." "Preacher, you might know the book, but you don't know me, and if I was still a believer, I'd pray you never knew my kind neither." Well, that was bald as anything, wasn't it? He stopped Hawk with a hand on the man's shoulder, hoping he didn't offend or draw back a bunch of bloody nubs. "I'm pleased and proud to have met you, Hawk. Whatever you have been, you're a good man now. I'm a right good judge of character." Hawk took a deep breath, head dipping a little. "I hope you're right, Padre." "I surely do." Squeezing, he nodded, moving just a bit closer. "I am. I know I am, Hawk. Trust me in this." Hawk's nostrils flared, the barest shudder moving the man. "I'll do my best." He hoped to hell he wasn't making Hawk uncomfortable. Preacher took his hand back. "I'm sorry if I offended, son." "Weren't me who's in danger of that, Padre. Come on. Fred, let's load up." Hawk turned and headed toward the saddlebag, a bulge in his kit that was unmistakable. Well, that didn't beat all. Smiling suddenly, Preacher followed Hawk perhaps a bit too closely. "Surely there's no need to load Fred up again so close to camp. Let me carry those for you. They're awful heavy." Hawk dropped one arm down, hiding his hunger, or trying to. "We'll walk slow." Oh, he was tempting fate, wasn't he? Pushing in beside Hawk, he bumped hips, getting a good feel of Hawk's lean body, a good sense of the man's scent. Rich and male and smelling of spring water and sweat, Hawk was enough of him to make a man fall into trouble. He leaned a little, just soaking it up like he had the water and the sunlight, the feeling of touching another person so rare and wonderful that before he knew it, his hand rested at Hawk's waist, his fingers massaging a bit. "Padre, you're hunting trouble." Hawk's breath sped, the scent of desire stronger, undeniable. "I imagine I am, but it feels like I'm doing right just at this moment." His own breathing went all uneven and rough, and he touched a little higher on Hawk's back, tracing the scars, thinking how that skin had looked in the sun. Damn, Hawk, damn." Hawk stopped walking, a raw groan filling the air. "Yeah, preacher." Well, that sounded like an invitation if he'd ever heard one, and he'd had more than a few back when his hair had been more gold than silver. Preacher turned just so, letting his mouth trail across Hawk's jaw, just like that. The stubble there was rough and wiry, tickling his lips and dragging against him. Lord, the man tasted just fine, just like he smelled. Little dusty, little sweaty, but all man and preacher needed that with a sudden, shocking passion. He swung him about, meeting Hawk's mouth full on, knowing it might surprise Hawk into running, but wanting it just the same. The sound that tore from Hawk vibrated down into him, the saddlebands landing on the ground with a crash. His long hands wrapped around his arms and tugged him closer. Lord love him. Preacher wrapped his arms around Hawk's back, pulling him up so they touched all along their bodies, so Hawk's prick pressed against him through their clothes. Hawk walked him back a few steps, his back coming smack against the rock. Those lean hips moved as if they had a mind of their own, and all the while their tongues flicked and moved, the motions desperate and furtive. Feeling the wildness, Preacher took his hat off, his hands shoving at Hawk's shirt, wanting that fine skin. Oh, hot. Good. His own hips rocked up and up, trying to get more. Thank the Lord Hawk hadn't taken time to do up the buttons. He let his fingers slide against heated skin, the muscles there rippling and jerking with their motions. Preacher touched like a blind man learning someone, his fingers sliding over every plane and scar and nook and cranny, kent and ribs. This might be his only chance. He had to make it count. The sounds that poured out of Hawk did not but inflame him, encourage one touch to turn to two, then three. The way that firm tan body rubbed against him did the job as well, making him figure he might not be utterly insane, or at least not alone in the insanity. When they had to part to breathe, Preacher let his mouth wander back down over that bristly chin that was so much rougher than that soft mustache, down to Hawk's throat. The scars there were ropey and thick, one ridge after another, fascinating his tongue as he traced each line. Hawk seemed to stop breathing as he moved, his lips and tongue lingering, his own moans shockingly loud in his own ears. There was something about Hawk's scars, something important, and Preacher gave them all the respect they deserved. The lean chest hitched, almost as if in a sob, long fingers tangled up in his hair, trembling like a leaf in the wind. Preacher leaned back to meet those ice-chip eyes with his own, staring at Hawk, making sure. This is good, yeah? Real good? Hawk just stared at him, nostrils flaring. Yes. The word was almost hissed, but then Hawk took his mouth, and he found he no longer cared. Leaning into that kiss, it was water, and he was a parched man. Preacher let Hawk taste him, opening right up and moaning, his hands on Hawk's head. He held the man to him and kissed and licked and touched, his hips moving faster and faster. One of Hawk's hands landed on his hip, moving him just so, and oh, they fit there, hand in glove, both grunting into a kiss that was suddenly fierce. Teeth clashed against lips, and Preacher tasted blood as he humped like Diamond on a bitch in heat. He just couldn't stop himself, roaring towards completion in too much of a hurry, the heat between them making him dizzy. The hand at his rear squeezed and tugged, and Hawk bucked, going stiff against him. A sharp cry bit off before it could escape. Ugh. The sound left him before he could stop it, his little death stealing the rest of his breath as his seed left him right there with his paint still on. He couldn't remember the last time that happened. They stood together, hearts pounding furiously, the scent of men and salt on the air. Hawk didn't say a word, but didn't pull away, just stood there as the sun set. Preacher leaned in, his movements slow and delicate as anything, and put a kiss to the corner of Hawk's mouth. Then he shook his head. Good thing we're still at the spring. The silence cracked like ice on a pond. Hawk nodded, swallowed hard enough that he heard it. You can take the skins with you after you're cleaned up. They'll come looking. I'll come along shortly. Are you... Preacher cleared his throat, cutting off all his questions. I'll do that. His hand traced Hawk's cheek, his fingers lingering before he turned away and walked back to the spring. Hawk's shadow fell across him as the man knelt to wet a cloth. I ain't gonna mar your name with your men. You couldn't, not for this. Bear ain't got no care for what I do, and Abraham don't know his prick is worth more than pissin'. And I'm my own man, Hawk. I'd do it again. And again if Hawk let him. One hand reached out, his finger tracing his shoulder. It's worth doing again. It is, Hawk, it surely is. They stared at each other again for a good long while before he smiled wryly. We best get on. Yes, sir. It's too close to pure dark to be wandering out here. Yeah, things do come out in the dark. Quickly, Preacher undid his pants and washed up before buttoning back up and grabbing the water skins. You come on right behind me. Not losing you now, for sure. Fred makes sure I keep to the right path. I'll be there, sure as dawn. I'll look forward to seeing you there, Hawk. I surely will. Somehow he couldn't bring himself to call Hawk son anymore. Hell, somehow that suited him just fine. I hope y'all enjoy, and I will be reading the second half of Chapter 3 next month. Much love, y'all. Bye.